All right, it's 6 minutes past 1 by my clock, so I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Matsidi Motane, and today I'll be chairing our seminar, which goes on every Wednesday, as most of you probably know. So today's speaker is Luke Spiropolous. Did I say it right, Luke? Okay, great. And his paper is titled Race and the Invention of Immigration Governance in the British Empire. So as usual, Luke will have 20 minutes to speak, following which we will do a Q&A. I think we can decide closer to that discussion session whether you'd like to do one round of questions and then respond, or if you'd like to answer every question individually, but I in my experience, just taking a round and kind of giving responses to that usually works. So without wasting more of your time, Luke, yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm sure some of you at least were attracted by the rather grand title, but hopefully all of you have taken a look at the abstract that I sent around so that we can sort of get into the meat of things quite quickly, because I basically got too much to say in the time, which is fairly standard for this seminar. So I want to start with a little bit of context to just get things going. The first point of which is that is an historiographical point, which has got to do with the historiography of migration in South Africa and Southern Africa. And that tends to focus on, for very good reason, on Indian immigration and settlement, and on sort of the questions of settlers, British and Afrikaans in particular. And then there's a slightly smaller, slightly more niche historiography of Jewish immigration and settlement, which does actually intersect a bit with what I'm talking about here. Now, obviously, one of the reasons that it's important to discuss questions of Indian immigration and settlement is that that is one of that history is the sort of key pivot around which immigration control history is, not just in Southern Africa, but basically throughout the British Empire. The history of Indian mobility and racialized Indian mobility is the key to understanding that history. However, to have an exclusion, to have an undesirable, you have to have some kind of conception of an inclusion or a desirable. That's the reason for the exclusion in the first place. And so what I'm doing by studying Greeks is effectively trying to understand the nature of that inclusion and the complexities that go with it. Because what happens when you study a group like Greeks, who are non-imperial, who are not subjects, but are not necessarily understood as part of the sort of grand plan of empire, is that you find the sort of complexities at the heart of trying to categorize people in neat boxes and to decide on the actual desirability of people is to actually draw out a spectrum of desirability, of most desirable to least desirable. Which is, as you might imagine, fairly difficult for people who are trying to form legislation to really deal with. So that's what this is about. So there are two sources of sort of ideological underpinnings for the inclusion and exclusion decisions, the desirability decisions that are being made in the British Empire and in South Africa in particular. The first of these takes place at a global level and a metropolitan level, i.e. in the UK, which is my focus, in contrast to some of the sort of traditional historiography that we deal with. I'm looking at things, at least to start with, from 1,000 feet, as they say. And that's the sort of global perspective, and that's in particular the conception of the liberal empire, in which free flow of goods, people, and ideas is a positive ideal that is sort of offset by desires to quote unquote protect subject peoples from each other and from other European predations, and premised on the idea of sort of static people who should be by nature in place in time, static. And in some competition with this is the project of settler colonialism. And settler colonies have some of the same ideas about status and people being divided into subjects and non-subjects, or people who are in a status of subjection to the settlers in this case. But where they distinguish themselves from each other is that the major concerns about mobile people in the settler colonies are obviously very much local. Global conditions are not as important to the people in the settler colonies. And so there's a constant tension between the metropole and the settler colonies about who should be treated as belonging and who should be treated as undesirable. And this comes to a head in the sort of timeline of things in the 19th century with the inventions of new technologies of mobility. So you have these steamship lines that are really plying the trade, and there's this huge explosion in trade within the British Empire. In particular, at the center of this is the jewel in the crown of this area of India. One of the results of that is that the existing networks of mobility from India take advantage of these same routes and themselves explode. And in response, the sort of countervailing effort is the invention of technologies of migration control. So technologies of migration control are things like the invention of the passport system, the invention of border control systems, the bureaucracies that emerge around that, and the systems that they use. The central purpose of these countervailing technologies is to render people more legible. So what they do is that they reach back into the deep history of the origins of this anxiety about mobility, which is sort of effectively a medieval kind of anxiety about the mobility of people who are subject to a lord. And they reach back into that and they start finding ways to sort of replicate the legibility and categorization and the sort of the inscription of people into a system of surveillance and control, and that's what we have today. That's effectively, a direct link from then till now. It starts in the late 19th century, and what we have now is more or less set in stone by the First World War. And what that gives us is the ability to categorize people. And what we're doing now, as opposed to previously, where we say, well, these people are subjects and it's self-evident, it's common sense, as the proposal would say, who the subjects are and who we are as the powerful. What this does is it says you have to write down in either a system of policy or in a system of law how you're going to distinguish these people. So this is the beginning of this sort of categorization that takes place, about racial categorization that takes place. Has its roots, the sort of legalized categorization has its roots in these efforts to control mobility and migration. So that is the context. Where we go from there is I want to talk about a few examples specifically in the British Archive, specifically about this relationship between the metropolitan desires to deal with migration policies as a centralized issue and mobility as a centralized issue through their imperial desires, and the tensions between that and settler colonial, in particular South Africa in this case, concerns about the mobility of people and how they want to take control of those mobilities. If you look at Jonathan Claren, he talks about how it's only sort of in the 1930s with some of the immigration legislation I'll be talking about that the sort of idea of a South African as a citizen, as having a citizenship, only really emerges around that time, because they then eventually inscribed so much categorization into these immigration laws that you're able to see the form of this citizen. Anyway, it's an aside. So, in order to do this, I need to access this presentation. I am not very good at PowerPoint because, as a historian, I'm allergic to it. But I think you're going to sort of get the idea. It's the first time I've had to do this. So this is a draft communique from the Foreign Office. Sorry, from the Commonwealth. No, sorry, this is the Foreign Office. I'm getting confused between my documents. From Foreign Office about what it is that the South Africans should be doing in 1909, 1910, when they're starting to think about the fact that they want to be a union and that they want to have a unified immigration control policy. And they're basically trying to develop what becomes the 1913 Immigration Act. what concerns the British is basically that the South Africans want to be very, very explicit. They want to incorporate a lot of the previous legislation in the Transvaal and the Natal Cape that has caused a lot of conflict with India and with Indians in South Africa. There's a quote, there's a citation in this document that you won't see of what Gandhi thinks about this stuff and what they think that the sort of the meat that they can offer to the Indian elites to make them allow the South Africans to have their laws. Why I think this is interesting is that what they've said is that these South Africans are being, that there's a whole bit rest of this file in which they're getting very upset with the South Africans going back on their agreements about being a home for the British, for British subjects. But in this particular part, they're basically saying, okay, if you want to have a piece of legislation, this is what we think it should go into it. We don't think it should be explicitly racist. We don't want you to be mentioning that you don't want people, it says here, of colored persons as such. What you should be is a bit more like the Australian Commonwealth, because they have a language requirement, a literacy and language requirement. And in this case, they use this example. They say that at the border post, the official, without having to have a legislation that's discriminatory, can basically ask any person to write something in Swedish or modern Greek, as an example, that they definitely don't know how to do, and therefore reject them out of hand. So they're basically finding ways to euphemize these embarrassing tendencies that the South Africans are showing to want to be explicit about what they do and don't want. So that's the first document. And then it goes on, if I can figure out how to get this to terrible. Come on. Right, so that same letter, a little bit later, they say, okay, what about, and I find this quite interesting that this is done on a sort of level of Commonwealth, at large. They want to use examples from other parts of the Commonwealth. They say, what about if you also institute within legislation as opposed to the practice? What if you institute a system of control that's found in Canada? This is the Canadian Immigration Act of 1910, and the following lines. Change this, blah, blah, blah. Observe, this section applies to all races and does not differentiate Indians. Again, you're creating a euphemistic way of doing things. And what they want to do, interestingly, is that they want to provide some way of, this is what I was talking about, the meat to elite Indians. They want to find some way to basically give a language test that allows 6 cultured Indians on an education test in English language into the union on an annual basis. All right, so that's that negotiation that's taking place, and in that case, the British are taking that negotiation from a position of authority, of power, and part of what they're doing is that they're thinking, if this applies to Indians, we are basically going to have problems in our other colonies, in India, but also in other colonies, and we're going to start having problems in places any other place that the South Africans suddenly decide that they don't like British subjects to come from. And so we need to basically find a way to have them set down in stone what they do and do not allow. All right. So the second set of documents emerges out of the First World War. You remember that I mentioned that the First World War is when they sort of started to really create the sort of very modern systems of immigration control. These are not about that. What these are about is about the British. Is about the British Empire. The British war effort, and about the diasporas that exist within the British Empire that they feel are potential threats to the system. So on the left, you have a document about Greek subjects of Greece, the country, the nation, which is some of whom are basically potentially British allies, and some of whom are basically potential German allies, and they want the Greek pro-British government to give them names of people who might be anti-British in the colonies so that they can have them arrested. So that's the first sort of status. The second one is almost slightly more interesting, which is that they want to know what to do about Ottoman subjects. So remember that the Ottomans are the enemy of the British in the First World War, but they have all of these subjects who are not Turkish, and they've decided that some of these non-Turkish Ottoman subjects are actually fine, and they shouldn't be treated as enemy subjects. And they specifically, in this case, refer to Greeks by race in the top line. So in the first paper, on the paper on the left, you see that they're talking about Greeks by nation, but on the right, they're talking about Greeks by race, and they're sort of basically trying to get local Greeks to tell them, does this person count as a Greek by race? Importantly, they're not including religion in the category of Greeks by race. It's a sort of very vague idea, but what they think is that Greeks by race are intrinsically anti-Turkish, and therefore they should be sort of on side, and we can differentiate them from the potentially pro-German Greeks who are the royalists. So there's a sort of complexity about who is desirable and who is undesirable on the basis there of a very complex set of ideas about both ethnicity and race and national political identity. Interestingly, this sort of confusion basically results in 1915 in South Africa in a series of riots in which the Greeks are treated as sort of natural enemies of the empire and therefore of South Africa, and there's a whole lot of Greek shops and houses that are burnt down by rioting South Africans. It also sets the tone for the post-war settlements in which the dominions in general basically sit the British down. In 1919 is sort of when it ends, when this really sort of kicks off. They sort of sit the British down and they say to them, we are going to be in control of our own immigration policies from now on, amongst other things. The dominions are now going to be much more independent than they have been before in the way that they make decisions with relation to the rest of the world. And that's the context in which the rest of this flurry of immigration control activity that happens after that takes place. The 1920s is full of different efforts, and the 30s full of different efforts to try and think of ways around the limitations on immigration control in dominions in general and in South Africa in particular. Right, so that takes me to my third example, which is from the 1930s. 1930-31, the South Africans institute these two laws which are actually intended explicitly to keep out Jewish immigrants from Europe. They're a sort of populist move. They're entirely linked to local politics and to sort of the rise of fascism in Europe. But one of the things that happens is that they send out communiques to all the British consuls who do all of their consulate work around the world, or more or less all of their consulate work around the world, to say to everyone who isn't part of a select group of great powers or influential powers that have agreements with the South Africans, that they can have as a quota of 50 people that can come in per year. So anyone in any of those other countries, including the Greeks, in this case, this is a letter to the Greeks, are basically deemed undesirable above a number of 50 people per year. And in this particular document, you have the British trying to decide how they're going to communicate this to the Greek government diplomatically, because again, they're the ones who have to deal with the diplomatic outlays. Yeah, and keep some sort of influence over the situation. But they're on the back foot. They basically have to say, we're going to tell the Greeks in this way or that way. Not that we're not going to allow this to happen. So that's the next one. And then finally, in 1948, and then again in 1953 and 1955, there is this sort of effort comes to a head on the part of the British and the South Africans. This sort of tension comes to a head, rather. Because what has been happening ever since the 1910 example is that the South Africans are heading towards increasing the ambit of what kinds of British subjects are considered undesirable or relatively undesirable. They realize that banning British subjects puts them in direct conflict with the British, and they've basically made the most of that by effectively banning Indians. But by 1948, what they want to do is that they want to start being clear about the category of non-European, and they've decided that this group that are named on this piece of paper here, where it's highlighted, are not of pure European stock. by which they mean white. I'm not, yeah, I'm not, this is a clear South African sort of version of the euphemism. This isn't the British version of Europeans. And this causes a whole lot of problems, because what's happening now is that the British are effectively starting to lose control of what's left of their empire. And if they start telling people in the empire, we are administering a system in which you are not considered fully European and therefore not desirable, in spite of the fact that you're in our empire, what they're basically saying is that a big part of the value of being a part of our empire is gone now. And a big part of the values of liberal empire are effectively irrelevant, because we no longer have the authority of centralizing these kinds of efforts. So that's why it sort of comes to a head. And effectively, what in 1948, what the British do is they say, give us a piece of paper that says permit instead of visa on it, and we can avoid thinking about the fact that this is causing problems for us. This is an example of them discussing these details. They're saying, if we're able to use a euphemism about visas, and we have something that isn't in the passport but is a separate piece of paper, then no one will question the bona fides of the applicant for entry as British subjects, and therefore we won't be causing ripples in our broader project of trying to keep the empire together and trying to sort of allay the concerns of people who don't really want to be part of the British Empire at all. So that's the sort of big broad brushstrokes of what we're dealing with here. And the sort of long and short of this, basically, is that throughout the period, the British are effectively on the back foot in trying to balance the interests and efforts of people in the dominions with the sort of effectively broader imperial project and the colonial possessions of the British throughout the world. And there's a constant march of demands from the dominions, using South Africa as an example, to limit further and further the ways that it's understood that the people who are subject to the British Empire are categorized as desirable or undesirable. That should be dealt with more and more at a local level. Thank you.
Sorry, great. Thank you, Luke. Thank you so much also for keeping to the time. It was 20 minutes almost on the dot. That was a really kind of fascinating, enlightening presentation. And of course, there's a lot of debates that happen, in the contemporary moment and in other historiography about issues of belonging and immigration. So thanks for that. Can we open it up to the floor for questions? And as we said before, I think it would be good to just take one full round of questions and then give Luke the opportunity to respond to all those. And please remember to unmute yourself when you do ask a question. Actually, I think while we wait for the questions to come through, Luke, let me just go through my notes, but I may have a question for you. Okay, so I'm not sure if I'll be able to kind of articulate this properly, but from what I got in one of the last sources is that European subjects were categorized by these three categories. And so I think my question is just quite broad, is whether you get a sense of how those categorizations affected the day-to-day kind of lives of these people. Because I'm not sure, but I would imagine that at this point, the technologies of controlling people through kind of limiting them to specific areas or settlements wasn't exactly in place, and I could be wrong. But I'm just curious about what that looked like beyond the bureaucratic categorization in the lived space. yeah, I mean, are there any other questions in the audience? Please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can type in the chat box where Luke will see your question.
Hi, Matsalisa, I have a question.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, Luke, thanks for a very interesting discussion of what you're finding so far. The one thing that intrigued me, and it was really from the beginning of your first slide, and it sort of weaves through all the different slides that you showed us, is this sort of nervousness or a feeling of the British imperial authorities don't want to be seen, or they're afraid to be seen to be discriminating. And I think it's rare to find some of the kind of insider conversation that is happening. Can you just say a little bit more about the origins of this? I mean, why are they so nervous about being seen to be discriminating? Yeah.
Should I just take those first two?
Yeah, I think you can go ahead and take those two.
Well, I should have probably prefaced this whole thing with saying that I haven't done a lot more than the research that I've done in the UK, which is almost entirely on this premise of dealing with very high level government interactions around people, individuals. But what I can tell you from what I have done is that, so for starters, there seems to be a lot of effort put into trying to find ways of not letting people in, even though they're kind of allowed to come in. And that, I mean, the thing about what I've just presented is that it's sort of quintessential historian stuff. It changes over that period of time from 1910 to 1948, or 1955 in this case. But throughout that period, there's sort of ways in which there's a generalized feeling that we need to control and limit the movement of these people who are of questionable desirability. We're not 100% sure how desirable they are. We're not all in agreement of whether they're actually white, and as such, whether or not they're actually desirable. And the repercussions for individuals is, I mean, obviously a whole lot of them who just don't get to go where they want to go. But there are also examples of, like I said, there were these riots in which people's places were burnt down. There are examples of people in during the Boer War, so slightly before this, basically having all their stock taken away from them and being exiled, and then not really having anywhere to turn to about that, and trying to turn to the British, and sort of having to try and work through their immigrant community rather than being able to actually turn to an authority that represents them. And that's like at the core of why I think it's interesting to study these Greeks, is because they don't have representation. The only like form of belonging that they have is within their sort of community structures, their diasporic structure, which deals with whatever political authority it has to deal with, and with their ability to claim whiteness. So Indians can claim British subjecthood, and that's the claim on which they make all of their demands, basically, in the South African case. That's the sort of big Gandhian thing, is we are British subjects, we should be treated with respect as British subjects. The Greeks can't do that. I mean, the Cypriots can, but the rest of the Greeks can't. What they can do is say, like, we are important in some way, and so it's in their interest to be as white as possible, effectively. And I'm like I say, I'm yet to get really into the weeds on how they managed to do that. But on a social level, they managed to do that in like very much trying to like incorporate that into their identities and their practices. And that's important also because of a whole lot of it feeds into a whole lot of literature about whiteness studies. There's a guy called Rudiger in the US in particular who sort of talks about this. The way to get access, to get belonging, is to differentiate yourself from the ultimate other. So I hope that sort of helps a bit in sort of setting the scene, at least, for how this actually affects people. On the question of the embarrassment, yeah, I thought this was really interesting. I wasn't expecting to find all of this sort of squeamishness. And but I have found it before. I found it when I did research in Botswana about Indians in Botswana. There's a desire. It's a desire to avoid public scandal. It's not a desire on their own part. They don't feel that this is wrong or incorrect in any way. And on a lot of occasions, they say, we sympathize. We also agree these Indians shouldn't be here, and we don't want them moving around as much as they do, and they cause trouble, and it's their own fault for being Indian, I guess, whatever you do to them. But we have an empire to look after, effectively. And the most important element of the empire for most of that period, is India. They're the most powerful sort of player in this empire, but they don't have the kind of independence that the dominions have. So there's this balancing act. We have this really important jewel in our crown, and we have these entities that are also important and are able to act on their own, and we have to try and balance between them. And we don't want any of that becoming public because it's going to make all of those jobs more difficult. So we have to try and keep things quiet. So that's the one aspect. There's also a book called now I'm not going to forget who wrote it, The Cult of Imperial Honor in British India, I think it's called. And that has to do, one of the aspects of this has to do with euphemism and how Louise White talks about this as well in the case of Rhodesia. Which is basically you can be as racist as you want, but you have to be euphemistic about it. You have to use concepts like civilization, and it's what South Africans often talk about, the difference between liberal racism and illiberal racism, right? Or in the South African case, traditionally, English racism and Afrikaans racism is often the way that it's sort of crudely put. What's happening there is they're saying you have to have your ducks in a row and be able to explain yourself in terms of race science and what's best for the empire and what's best for the community and the practicalities of things and all of these things. There's a part of one of the first documents that I actually excluded in which they say that because the British are able to, in Australia rather, they're able to exclude people on the basis of these sort of tests. They're able to avoid a whole lot of this embarrassment, and they're able to avoid having to answer for how they're categorizing people. They don't have to start explaining away the undesirability of these people because it's agreed that they're undesirable.
Thanks, Luke. Yeah, that was it was an interesting kind of answer. There's another question here in the chat from Laszlo who says, thank you for your presentation, Luke. How did Greeks categorize themselves on the racial totem pole? And were there any ways in which Greek immigrants tried to circumnavigate such discriminating immigration legislation? So, you did mention riots and things like that, but I guess what Laszlo's getting at is whether there were any other forms of resistance to these categorizations and, what the self categorization in terms of race is.
Yeah, again, I don't have that much information from the community itself at this point. I have little snippets coming out of sort of people making applications for visas and things in Britain, trying to get the British to get on their side. And those generally don't speak to race so much, as far as I can tell. I guess there's one example where a person says I'm clearly European, and in their case they're Cypriot, and they say, and I'm British subject, and so I should be treated accordingly. So they're clearly identifying themselves as Europeans, but that does go back into a sort of much deeper history in Greece itself, in which there's a big division. In the early 19th century, when they're starting to develop ideas of independence from the Ottomans, about who is about basically how they're going to get this independence and who they're going to be as a nation, and the elites who are sort of developing these ideas of a Greek nation, of a modern Greek nation, are very much influenced by the idea that they're Western European and they're this sort of the cradle of civilization, and so they're trying to appeal as much as possible to the French and to the British ideas of enlightenment and etc. and drawing a link between classical Greece and modern Greece, and getting a lot of support as a result for the War of Independence against Ottoman. So there is that like tradition in Greece of we are deeply European, we're the most European. We are the origins of Europe. But there's also a much more populist kind of thing in which they're Greeks. They identify largely with the church and with their language. And the language is actually, at that point, a lot of dialects, but mostly it's with the church, with the Greek Orthodox Church is the main identifier. And so you find that people start organizing in South Africa around like what region of Greece they're from and around the local priest. So I have a document of a priest who wants in the First World War, who wants to come to South Africa to be the bishop of the church in South Africa, and there's a long conversation about whether he's desirable or not. And basically, the Greek government in Greece wants him to go to South Africa because he's loyal to the side that's loyal to the British, and so he's effectively a community leader. Is expected to be a community leader and to like whip everyone into shape and into line. So there's a sort of hierarchy of identities as there is with everyone. How they eventually, what happens over time is that they realize that their position on this totem pole is as whites, and that's basically what's going to get them through. They can't stick around. They can't take any advantages. They're basically in the same place as Indians, except that they happen to be white, and so they're able to take advantage of that, and that's their competitive advantage, if you will. And so they lean into that over time. So if you talk to Greeks now, they'll tell you, there was a time when we weren't fully white. Some of them will tell you there was a time when we weren't fully white. Can you believe that? We're so obviously very, very white. Whereas at that time they may not have said that.
There's another question in the chat. Thanks, Luke. It says, "Hi, Luke. Thanks for the presentation. Do you have a sense of the numbers of Greek immigrants trying to come to South Africa during your period, including those denied access?" That's an interesting one. And my sense, having looked briefly at Saint Helenians coming to South Africa in the 19th century, is that it was a small group, but with issues of racial classification, or the issue of racial classification meant that it was still a matter of serious concern. And then I think there's another hand up. I mean, I don't know if we want to take that, but I think you can answer this, and then whoever's hand is up can just...
Clive Blazer.
Oh, is it Clive? Oh, okay. Do you want to take Clive as well, or would you like to get into this one?
Let me just get into this one. We're in a sort of mode now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's Rebecca Swartz who's asking the question. She seems to be sharing with Laszlo. Yes, so Saint Helenians, interestingly, I found a number of little bits in the same files about Saint Helenians, which is quite interesting because the British don't really know much about the Saint Helenians. So they're asking questions like, how fair are these Saint Helenians? Like, will they pass for white? This is in sort of early stages before people have very clear, sort of clear categories and documentation about these things. But I found that very interesting. There's sort of, can we get one over on these South Africans? I have a document in which a Jewish Egyptian woman is married to a British man who wants to come and work in South Africa in the embassy, and there's a sort of argument about, will she pass for white? If she passes for white, then maybe because they're under the same surname, there won't be a problem with them living together and moving there together. And that's in the 1950s, so that's pretty late for that sort of thing to be happening. And that also speaks to the weird kind of categorization that takes place in the 50s in South Africa, because what they eventually do, this is what I was talking about with their proposal, what they eventually do is that they say, we're not going to wait for the sort of quote-unquote race science to catch up with reality. We're going to work with common sense categories. If people in general think you're white enough to be white. If you're like part of a community and people think, you have habits and ways of doing things that are white, and other people who we think are white think you're white, then you're white, and then your children will be white forever after, and we'll have a solution to this problem from now on. I'm getting sidetracked with that. Numbers. Numbers are hard. The South Africans are surprisingly good at keeping statistics, but they break them down in very odd and inconsistent ways. The numbers of Greeks, at least for the first, up until the 20s, which is what I have numbers for, is very low. It's like a few hundred a year, I think. But I also know that there's a lot of, from my previous research on Indian immigration and from some of the documents that I've been looking at now, there is actually a lot of illicit immigration taking place specifically through Mozambique and Swaziland. And this is particularly true for Cypriots, because the Cypriots are, as I said, they start out being completely unregulated, and then gradually they're sort of winnowed down as being less and less white, or less and less desirable. And then you start seeing complaints in the press and in Parliament about Cypriots slipping in through Swaziland, because Swaziland, being a British protectorate, their border controls don't recognize the distinction between different kinds of British passports, and so they're just letting people through. So anyway, basically numbers hard, but the numbers are not large. They sort of just build slowly into. The community never gets very big, but it sort of becomes quite significant in terms of the commercial role and things like that. But it builds and it builds. The other thing that happens is it just occurred to me. The other thing that happens in the 1960s is South Africans do an about turn on immigration, and they basically decide that we have these categories of desirable, of white and not white, that are relatively clear now. What we'll do is we'll just encourage people who are white to come here, and we won't be losing out on this sort of demographic challenge that we see ourselves facing. We're worried about our numbers, our birth rates, so we're going to start importing white people. So they particularly want to import people from the UK and Northern Europe, and they have agreements with the Netherlands and Germany, etc. They have people doing, they put up propaganda to encourage people to move, but that's the 1960s. That's like later when they've completely changed their tune about the way that this is supposed to work. When they're being populist in the earlier phase, when they're feeling like they're not definitely in control, they're very anti-immigrant in lots of different ways.
Okay, thanks, Luke. The next one is, I'm not familiar. It's Kaylee Forrest. I'm not familiar with the Greek immigration riots in South Africa. Can you speak more about this?
Sorry, should we not ask Clive?
Oh yes, sorry. Excuse me, Clive. Please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Luke. Yes, there's a lot of interesting stuff here, particularly from the sort of imperial end. And of course, I encountered quite a lot of this very similar material in my work on the Madeirans. I suppose there are a couple of questions I wanted to ask you about illegal immigration, because in fact, with the case of Madeira, I think more actually came in illegally than came in legally, and there was an enormous amount of discussion about illegal Madeirans and how what their status was and what it took to be in order to be able to become legal. And of course, they were using the porous Mozambican border as a way of coming in on a large scale. So I wanted to ask you a bit about that. The other thing I think that's interesting, just linked to the last point you were making, is that Afrikaner nationalism starts to play a role here in who they decide to let in as immigrants and who they don't. Because, I mean, I think Afrikaner nationalists, I think, were very concerned about the balance of the demographic balance amongst white South Africans. And so they were very concerned. One big concern for them was to only let in white immigrants who would assimilate as Afrikaner rather than as English speaking. So that's also an interesting complication for a lot of this discussion. And I think it's only when there's a severe skilled labor shortage in the 1960s, later 1960s, that they start to become less tetchy about letting in sort of darker skinned Catholics from the south of Europe. So there's just a couple of points there.
Yeah, I can actually answer both of these questions at the same time, because
okay, please, yeah.
Sorry, Kelly, I know very little about these riots. I've seen them come up in some of the work of in secondary sources. Basically, people talk about how there was this division and this lack of clarity about who was going to be, on whose side the Greeks actually were. and that was stoked up by these sorts of conflicts within the Greek community as well. In South Africa, there was conflict over this stuff. In the archives, there's one story about a guy who's a policeman in the Transvaal police who's Greek, which is interesting in and of itself, and who's basically using this opportunity, this position, to lord it over the Greek community and abuse the Greek community and try and force them into a royalist, which is pro-German camp. And when they dispatched this priest to be the bishop, what they're doing is they're dispatching what they think is happening is they're dispatching this guy's cousin, the policeman's cousin, who's a priest, to come and basically get him to calm down and to bring the flock, as it were, back into the fold of the Venizelists, who are the pro-British. So, yeah, sorry, I don't know much about those riots, other than that there's some evidence of property destruction, and that it took place on the basis of this question of whose side they were on, that they were sort of fifth columnists. Coincidentally, this is something that the British are concerned with in the First World War and the Second World War. There's this large British diaspora throughout the empire, large as in spread out in a large way, and so they start issuing edicts about watching these Greek traders on the border of Congo and Tanzania, or I can't even remember all of these places where they're having these sort of side battles in the First World War. That these Greeks are potentially spreading information for the Germans and are spreading propaganda for the Germans. Anyway, so that's the sort of background of that stuff. I only have one source, Clive. I'm hoping to find a lot more when I get more into people's personal histories, people's personal archives, and I haven't done any oral histories yet. So I'm hoping to find a little bit out about illegal immigration through them. I do know that there were some. I have this one document about particular Cypriots using their British status to get in through the Swaziland, via Mozambique through the Swaziland border, and there's complaints about that in a couple of places as well. There's also complaints about British from England not being registered and being checked out to see if they're desirable or not, because you also have to have a clean criminal record in order to come in. So that's an aside. But I haven't yet been able to do quite as much as you did with the Madeirans, unfortunately. I find the question of the place of Greeks in relation to Afrikaner nationalism particularly interesting. Because, as you say, there's this clear desire to get, in particular, Dutch and Germans in, and they make a special effort. They create a separate company for mainland Europe, for the Netherlands and Germany, to encourage them to move into the country in the 60s and before. But actually, the bulk are coming from the UK, because there's an existing sort of pipeline, as it were. But there are a number who seem to come from those places. Their issue with Madeirans being Catholic, though, feels like it would be different from their issues with the Greeks being Orthodox. And the reason I say this is that in other parts of the Commonwealth and other parts of Southern Africa, where they're more explicit about how they're going to try and control immigration, because they're using these mechanisms of, they're not using legislative mechanisms as much as they're using sort of administrative mechanisms. They have to talk about it more. And what comes up is that these Greeks are not fully white, because so many of them follow this strange, very Oriental kind of religion. And that's the language that they use. The Australians in particular, where there's a large Greek immigration, are telling the Rhodesians and the South Africans, basically, don't let them in, try to keep them out as much as you can, because they have bad habits, and they're basically Easterners of some form. They're not actually Westerners. And it's got to do with like the aesthetics, as far as I can tell, of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Or Greek Orthodox Church in this case. So that's an aside of sort of how they're thinking about this group of people. I don't think that they have this idea, with the papists, and there's a deep history of sort of anti-Catholicism in the history of the Dutch Reformed Church. which I don't know if it applies to these funny Greek, effectively pagans. Yeah, I mean that's as much as I can say about that. And I am thinking I need to look much more closely in the South African archives into questions of how they're recruiting people. And I say this partially because the one of the 2 or 3 kind of oral history efforts that I've made in the past was with a woman who came to South Africa without any information, without any English, basically because she found a pamphlet in the Greek version of the South African recruitment company that looked nice. She saw some pictures of beaches and mountains and I guess Hillbrow Tower, and she thought that looks like a nice place to go, and my opportunities here in Greece are minimal, and I'm a nurse, I'm a qualified nurse, I'm moving to this country with my husband. And she did, and she basically made things work for herself here for the rest of her life. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Thanks, Luke. There's one more question, and I see we still have a bit of time, but it's from Ali, and he says, there's a study that makes the argument that people of Jewish ancestry had an opportunity to identify with Black people on their arrival here in South Africa. However, a large section of the study argues that the Jewish fought hard to be classified as white. Would you make a similar argument about the Greeks?
If the community as it stands now is anything to go by, then definitely. But that's all I have to go by, right? I don't have a lot of evidence about that. I know that they, as I said, they lean into the idea that they're definitely white, and there's a lot of racism that goes on, and I mean, obviously that's not very special, but it's not like they ever lean into the idea that they weren't white or that they didn't want to be white. However, what they do is that they distinguish themselves from Afrikaans and English and other groups. They're very much the identity of being Greek and being part of a Greek community and having their own institutions. So, setting up the Saheti School, for example, in Johannesburg is like a major theme through the history of the Greeks in South Africa, trying to create institutions for themselves. The church, the community clubs, the regional groups, all of these things are basically about insularity rather than trying to become more South African white. So that's about as what I could say about that, I'm afraid.
All right. Thanks, Luke. I mean, the part of this discussion that's really fascinating to me as you were speaking is that immigration route through places like Swaziland. And I wonder obviously you said you haven't done a lot of oral history stuff around this, but I wonder what the social remnants of that may be, right? And whether there are kind of other pockets of Greek communities within places like Swaziland, and whether their social kind of assimilation into the country looks different from South Africa. But I guess that'll just be a point of curiosity until you find more on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you that there are Greeks in Mozambique. They're definitely Greeks in Swaziland. They're Greeks everywhere, basically.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I would imagine. Maybe it was easier for them to just kind of settle there, or there were other things about those countries that may have been appealing.
To
the immigrants.
I mean, one of the documents about the illegal immigration, Clive, back to that, I'd forgotten about this. One of the documents was about a pair of Cypriots in Mozambique who were helping Indians to move into South Africa.
Oh, wow.
I mean, presumably, for profit. It's not, no one's doing this stuff for fun. Another example, by the way, Tafendas, the guy who killed Fobut, grew up in Mozambique. I mean, the Mozambican Greek. Anyway.
Yeah. And I think sorry, Luke, I think as you're speaking, this is just kind of reminding me of another question that I had about what the Greek community's relationship with other kind of Europeans classified as not so Europeans was. So the St. Helenians and the Cypriots, like what was there any form of kind of informal or even formal solidarity that was that was taking place between these groups on account of, their perceived difference from the main European race?
Well, with the Cypriots, the Cypriots are basically Greeks, and they speak Greek. Okay, that's a statement that could get me into big trouble. But there's a long-standing history of basically Greek-speaking Cypriots wanting to be part of Greece, and Greeks wanting Cyprus to be part of Greece. And anyway, I'm not going to get into that. But basically, they have a lot in common. Most of them are Orthodox, and they speak very similar. They speak a version of Greek, effectively. So with the case of the Cypriots, they're like that. In the case of the Centilenians are a whole other story. They're like Mauritians. They're an island near Africa. They're effectively Africans of one sort or another, and so that's a different thing. And I don't think they ever become white. If Rebecca can correct me if I'm wrong. But what does happen, and what you find now, and so this is anecdotal, but what you find now is there's a lot of connection between Italian, Greek, Lebanese, and Portuguese communities, having basically settled in similar neighborhoods and doing similar kinds of work. So anecdotally, there's definitely something that's going on there in which there's some solidarity, but I think it's got to do with class and coincidence.
All right, cool. Thanks, Luke. I think we can take one more question. It's already after 2. I think there was someone whose hand is up, and I'm not sure if it's Clive again.
It was Noah.
It's Noah. Okay, so please go ahead. For some reason, I can't see I can just see the hand is raised, but not who has raised it. So, Prof, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Machiji. So, in fact, I did lower my hand because you touched on the question I wanted to raise, and I know we're over time. But I wanted to know to what extent, Luke, the category of Greek is interrogated from this point of view in terms of the sense of being European and therefore potentially white in relation to the population exchange of 1923. So in Greece, right, people who came or were regarded as kind of part of Turkey took some time before they became integrated into the kind of the concept of Greeks as European. So I wonder the extent to which that great exchange of 23 shaped perceptions about their whiteness in the colonial context, if at all.
I don't really have an answer to that. I don't have enough information to answer that. I think it's important, probably, but okay. So, just a distinction to be made here at one point, in part in relation to one of the documents that talked about Greeks by race, who, regardless of religion, the reason that I think that that's important is that in 1922, I think I might be getting confused, but I think it's 1922. The South Africans are taken to court by a Lebanese business person who they're trying to divest of land because he's quote unquote not white, he's an Asiatic being Lebanese, and the Lebanese business person wins on the grounds that he's Christian, basically. That's the decision that they come to. So the argument actually that they end up making is that if the Lebanese, by virtue of being racially fundamentally from the East, being from the Middle East, are Asiatic, then so are Jews, because you're not taking into account any other aspects of them. You're talking about like some kind of deep intrinsic, racial makeup. Then Jews are also Middle Eastern. Otherwise, what was it all about? And you can't be divesting all of the Jews of all of their property as well. No matter, you might want to at that particular point in time, but they can't. And so they basically come up with a rule that the Lebanese, if they're Christian, are white, and if they're Muslim, they're not white. So amongst the Greeks, Greeks who are Muslim, as you mentioned, who don't get fully incorporated into the Greek nation because of this sort of distinction, would not be allowed into South Africa to start with. So those who are there already would gradually be basically winnowed out because their options would be limited. because there was now this precedent of, one more aspect of what makes you white is that you can't be Muslim. Otherwise, I don't really know much about Greek Muslims trying to come to South Africa, and I don't know much about what the effect of that kind of split amongst people about who counts as Greek and who doesn't affects things later down the line. As this document says that there are people who are Ottoman subjects, and I've got a record in the South African archives that talks about Ottoman subjects. So we know that they're there, but I don't know anything else about them, I'm afraid. Sorry.
All right, thanks, Luke, and thanks everyone for a really enriching kind of discussion. I also look forward to seeing, how the rest of the project progresses, and maybe you'll come speak again in one of these seminars and give us an update on how the research is going. But I think we're going to end it here if there aren't any other questions. And yeah, just a thank you for everyone for joining the discussion. And I think next week's seminar will be held in person, but you'll get an update about that in your emails in the next couple of days or so. I don't know if you have any kind of closing remarks, Luke, before we sign off. None.
Not really. Oh, actually, I did. There was one thing that I wanted to say in my presentation that I cut out for time, which is that the point about sort of developing these systems, these technologies, and categorizing where people are, and the point that I made about Jonathan Klein about who becomes a citizen by virtue of immigration laws, those categories, those like boundaries that are set up in that period, that's what we live with today. So when people are talking about people who are South Africans and people who are not South Africans, who are from one side or other side of the border, this is the period in which that basic category has been decided, and it's just been treated as a sort of natural entity that was formed. But they took boundaries that were sort of geopolitical, and they decided to introduce ideas about basically introduce permanence to them by incorporating this technology into those borders. So I think like this is not like just an historical thing. We're living with these repercussions of this stuff today.
All right.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Luke, and thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.